Hello, everyone. We are here again with another talk for the series of talks that we have been doing for the past 2 months from the United States Spiritist Federation. We are very happy today because we have our dear friend Peter Hayes here with us. Peter is the president of the Spiritist group Love and Light in New Jersey. He has done lectures on Spiritism within the United States and has participated in several of the U.S. Spiritist symposiums sponsored by the United States Spiritist Federation. Besides all that, we have been known Peter for quite some time. We have been good friends with him, his wife, his son, and we are very happy to have him here today. So, but before we start, as always, we will start with a little prayer, and then I'll give the word to Peter that will conduct to us the special talk that he has prepared for us today. So let us all elevate our hearts and our thoughts, reaching out to our Heavenly Creator, asking for the blessings, for the guidance, for all this effort that we have been doing to disseminate love and enlightenment throughout this planet. May we be inspired by the words of Peter today, take them to our hearts, but above all, may they become actions in our day-to-day lives. We pray for all the good spirits, the benefactors that have been assisting us in this journey, and for all of those that are now joining us. May they all feel the embrace of the good spirits, and may they all be inspired to become better each and every day. And we ask permission to start this meeting. So Peter now is with you.
Mm-hmm. Hi there. If you get to go to Jerusalem today, you might be able to visit a very popular pilgrimage site, popular tourist spot called Via della Rosa. And Via della Rosa marks the stations that make up the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus. And if you follow the path of Via della Rosa, which is a kind of circuitous route, you will wind up at the end at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And if you go inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you'll see a very ornate altar. That is the spot that is said to be where Jesus was actually crucified. Nearby this altar is the stone of anointment, or stone where Jesus' body was laid. And then near there is the sepulchre itself, the cave in which Jesus was buried. The sepulchre is connected to the story of the resurrection. And the resurrection essentially goes like this. Mary Magdalene and other women go to anoint the body of Jesus in the cave after the crucifixion. When they get there, they discover that the body is gone. And there's an angel that tells them that Jesus has risen, and Magdalene is told to go to the apostles and tell them to meet Jesus at Galilee. So they do this. And then what happens is that, and that's in the version of Matthew. In the version of Mark, it's slightly different. In Mark, Mary goes to see the apostles, tells them the body of Jesus is missing, and Jesus appears there and says, "Meet me at Galilee." So the apostles go to Galilee and they meet Jesus there. And then Jesus says the following before he ascends. In Mark, it goes like this. In Mark chapter 16, go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole of creation. Matthew is a little different. In chapter 28, he says, Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. These words in this moment is the inspiration for today's lecture. Go and preach. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to go and preach, because I think there's a few different implications to this. But these words inspired in Christianity the Great Commission, which meant to engage in ministry, engage in ministry work, missionary work, uh, evangelization, and baptism. But also, um, these words are having to do with the word preach. So, what does preach mean exactly? Well, in the dictionary, preach means to deliver a sermon. Another meaning for the word preach is to urge acceptance or abandonment of an idea or course of action. So, obviously, preach means to persuade. But fact is, the word preach, in English at least, and perhaps especially in the United States, can have a more pejorative meaning. For example, this is also in the dictionary. Preach can also mean to exhort in an officious or tiresome manner, so to be tedious. Preachify, to preach ineptly or tediously. And preachy would be marked by officious moral exhortation. So this is when preaching is not done well. But part of the purpose of the Great Commission, for instance, was to try and encourage and inspire people to follow the teachings of Jesus, of course. As I mentioned, it's an important pillar in Christianity. But the word preach has other implications, as I mentioned. But before I get there, I'm going to go back and ask a basic question. Why did Jesus, after he was crucified, appear before the apostles? Why did Jesus essentially need to tell them to go and preach? Didn't they know this already? I mean, the apostles spent a lot of time with Jesus. They were blessed by his presence, by the wisdom of his words, and yet he has to remind them to carry on. He had mentioned it many times before. Well, yes, he needed to remind them for a few reasons. First of all, when Mary Magdalene discovered that Jesus' body was missing, and Mary goes to tell the apostles, some of them didn't believe it. And when Jesus appears at Galilee, the apostles are waiting, they're waiting, and they still don't necessarily believe it. In other words, the apostles struggled with faith. And if you look at chapter 19 in the Gospel according to Spiritism, Faith Moves Mountains, it talks a lot about the importance of faith. And the Gospel, chapter 19, starts with the story from Matthew where a father whose son has epilepsy goes to Jesus and says, "Can you please help my son? I went to your apostles, and your apostles were not able to help him." And Jesus gets a little impatient and he says, "Oh, unbelieving and perverse generation, how long will I remain with you?" And Jesus says, "Bring the boy to me." And Jesus casts out, the gospel says demon, but Spiritists would understand this as an obsessor spirit that the boy had. And Jesus removes the obsessor spirit, convinces the obsessor spirit to go elsewhere, and the boy's fine. Now, the apostles are a little embarrassed about this, and they go to Jesus afterward, and they say, "Why couldn't we help the boy?" And Jesus says to them, "Because you lack faith." And then comes the famous expression or saying from Jesus about, if you have just a faith as small as a grain of mustard seed, you can then move mountains, that nothing will be impossible to you. Now, the gospel talks in chapter 19, Faith Moves Mountains, about the nature of faith. It says that, first of all, regarding faith, we have to have confidence in our own faith. So the more we go through various experiences in life, the more we confront whatever struggles we have, the more we begin to develop a genuine confidence and belief in our own faith. And the gospel also points out that when Jesus says you can move mountains, it's not literally moving mountains. He's talking about the emotional mountains that we have within us, our own faults. For example, if we're predominantly selfish, if we give in to prejudices, let's say we're prone to believe in fanaticism. Those are mountains that we have to remove. Let's say we have a lot of pride. Though that's another mountain. So there's the personal mountains, but then there's life's obstacles, all the struggles that we go through that one can think of. All of those are mountains. Anything that any of us are confronting in our lives right now is a mountain. Chapter 19 also emphasizes that faith must be calm and confident because it's supported by reason. Again, Spiritism is a reasoned faith. It does not encourage blind faith. And the more we use our reason to arrive at our understanding of things and our understanding of why we're here on earth, then it's easier for us to develop a genuine faith that's calm. By contrast, if we have a wavering faith, that tends to feed on itself because it senses its own weakness. So if we're dishonest with ourselves in some way, if we're giving into blind faith, for instance, then we're more likely to have a kind of faulty faith. It's a little bit like in the chapter 7, I believe it is in Matthew, Jesus talks about our house, our emotional house, our spiritual house. Is it built on rock, which is solid, or is it built on sand, which is weak and will collapse when the winds blow, for instance? So when we have a genuine and solid faith, then our foundation is more steady. But having confidence in our faith does not mean being arrogant about it. And this is really important because there's positive confidence in which we feel more at peace and more calm. But then there's the not so positive confidence in which we have an exaggerated sense of importance. We have perhaps a lot of pride. We think we're better than everybody else, and so forth. And that is not the point that's being emphasized in this chapter. There's an interesting comment made in chapter 19 of the Gospel, which basically talks about the power of faith. And it's saying that when we develop a genuine faith, we can sort of hook into a deeper energy, as it were. And this is, for example, relevant to pass giving. If you go into a Spiritist center and you want to receive a pass, the people who are administering the passes are people who have a good heart and they are wanting to serve God. What they're also doing is, ideally, is they're turning themselves over to the power of God. Pass givers are allowing themselves to be a vessel through which the power of God can flow through to help administer the pass. And so when we have genuine faith that this will occur and that we have genuine faith in God, and we accept that there's a lot of things that are being decided upon that we don't know anything about, that we don't have full awareness of our spiritual journey, for instance. When we develop that kind of faith, a trust in God, then we can allow the force that they have within. As it says here, if all souls could be convinced of the force they have within, and if they genuinely want to place their will at the service of this force, they too could produce these so-called miracles, meaning, for instance, healing. And again, the key phrase here is at the service of this force. In other words, when we turn ourselves over to God and put our faith and trust in God, then the power of God can begin to flow through us. And the gospel, according to Spiritism, also points out that it wasn't, and I don't mean to suggest before that the apostles did not have faith. Yes, the apostles struggled with faith in Mark and Matthew and Luke and so forth, and John, but that doesn't mean they didn't have faith or wouldn't eventually have faith. In Acts, which follows the time after Jesus has left, in chapter 3, for instance, Simon Peter and John show up at the second temple. And there they see a man begging for alms, a man who is not able to walk, somebody who's been at this spot for a long time. And Peter looks at him and says, I cannot give you alms, but I will give you what I do have. And Peter holds out his arms and says, in the name of Jesus, walk. And Peter reaches and brings the man up to his feet, and the man can walk. And so the three of them go into the second temple together. And this gets noticed. And yes, this will eventually get Simon, Peter, and John into some trouble with the religious authorities at that time. But nevertheless, it's an example of how the apostles, even if they struggled with faith at one point, they eventually began to receive faith. And this is an important point about which the Gospel chapter 19 also talks about. In order for faith to really work, we have to keep working on faith. So to be worthwhile, faith must be constantly active and never dulled by inaction. It's a little bit like a long-term relationship, a marriage, for instance. It always requires our attention and our effort and our work. Well, faith is the same way. And in chapter 19 of the Gospel according to Spiritism, it opens with the parable of the withered fig tree. So in this story, it's a parable. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. This is in Matthew. Jesus is on his way into Jerusalem, and he's hungry. And he is thinking about some fruit, and he sees a fig tree. And he gets a little closer to the fig tree and notices that the fig tree does not have any fruit because it's not in season for figs. And Jesus says, may you never bear fruit again. And then he continues on into Jerusalem. The next thing that follows is the well-known scene where Jesus goes to the second temple, sees the money changers in the second temple, and he drives them out and is upset that people are misusing the house of worship for commerce in this way. Well, when they come back from that event, they pass by the fig tree again, and the apostles notice that the fig tree has withered. And they point that out to him, say, Rabbi, the fig tree has withered. And Jesus reminds them, you need to put your faith in God. When you put your faith in God, you can move mountains. And he talks about prayer in that moment, the importance of prayer. So one of the ways we develop our faith is to constantly engage in prayer, because when we engage in prayer, it is like a telephone line to God. We are connecting to God. We're connecting to that force. What I'm going to do now is start to shift this lecture a little bit and talk about Francis of Assisi, because I've been talking about what it means to go and preach. And part of the implications of go and preach is that it's important that we put what we learn into practice and that we go out and try to be the best example that we can be. So go and preach can also mean lead by example. And there are many examples of individuals who've done this, but one of the greatest examples would be Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi, in the minds of many, is regarded as one of the greatest Christian ever in many people's minds. Francis is someone who really understood what Jesus was trying to say. He definitely tried to live by example the teachings of Jesus. So in terms of the theme of go and preach, it could be followed through the example of Francis. Francis is significant for a number of reasons. Part of it has to do with the time in which he was born. He was born in 1182. He passed away in 1226. He founded the Order of the Friars Minor in 1208. And this order, about 2 years later, more or less, would be recognized and sanctioned by Pope Innocent III. Francis is significant in a number of ways because Francis Francis was not really interested in tearing down the church and overthrowing the church. Rather, he wanted to remind the church of what really mattered. And so Francis tried to emulate Christ as best he could. And in doing so, he tried to exemplify what Christ was teaching. So again, as I said before, he was leading by example. Francis is popular among Spiritists. In the book Love Exists Among Us, a Spiritist book by Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro, he says this about Francis. He said that Francis is much loved by Spiritists because he was considered a great messenger, that he was sent to really help humanity advance. How did he do this? Mainly by making sure, by putting love at the heart of religion and making that more important than political or social issues. And this is significant because Francis lived in the medieval period. There were a few things going on in the medieval period that make the timing of his arrival significant. First of all, the church was very powerful back in the medieval period. The source of power in the medieval period was land, and the church had a lot of it. The church had become an institution by this point. More than 1,000 years after the time of Jesus, the church was very powerful indeed. And in addition to that, money was starting to get introduced into society as a form of wealth, which for some people was a very strange thing because when you think about it, you can put your hands in land, you can feel the soil in your fingers. That makes sense. But to hold a piece of paper and say this is worth something, it was strange. And Francis, I think, himself struggled with this, which I'll touch on soon. But in terms of the life of Francis, the first biographer of Francis was Thomas of Solano. Thomas was a friend and a fellow friar. And he wrote a biography about Francis about 2 years after his death. And the reason this happened is because Francis, by this point, was a very revered Christian. And Pope Gregory IX wanted to build a church as a burial site for Francis. And he also commissioned a biography on Francis. So Thomas of Solano was picked because he was very educated. He had a great deal of knowledge about theology. And in his descriptions of Francis, there is a lot of sort of biblical references in them. But thanks to this biography, and there are two biographies actually. There was one written about 1228, 1229, and then approximately 20 years later, Thomas of Solano wrote a second biography on Francis. These are primary historic sources, and because of it, we do have a lot of information about Francis. Francis, again, was a revered saint, but the significance is how he got there. How did he become the Saint Francis that is so deeply admired and loved? His journey is an interesting one, because if you look at his early life, you wouldn't necessarily imagine at all that he was going to wind up for the greatness that he accomplished. Francis was born in 1182. He was the son of a rich cloth merchant named Pietro de Benedone. And Thomas of Solano talks about Francis's early life, and it's not really a compliment. He says that Francis was basically spoiled. So it says his parents reared him in accordance with the vanity of the age. In other words, his parents were well-to-do and they pretty much indulged him. And Thomas of Solano goes on to point out that children of the well-to-do are often slaves of sin by displaying nothing of the Christian religion in their lives and conduct. They would just settle for the name Christian. So, in other words, they were people who would go to church. They probably supported the church, certainly, but they were kind of going through the motions, and one can just imagine how they behaved outside of church. But these descriptions, as harsh as they can be, are probably how Francis saw himself too. And and yet, that doesn't mean that he wasn't prepared. In chapter 19 of the Gospel according to Spiritism, it does talk a little bit, or hints at, that some people, because of past lives, because of in previous lives they prepared for this, they may be better prepared to develop a genuine sense of faith. I'll put it this way, they could be more hardwired for faith. And Francis displayed examples of being more hardwired for faith, but not in the very beginning. If you look at the first 23 years of his life, from the time, say, he was a teenager up till about the age of 23, Francis was basically kind of a party animal. He wasn't mean, he wasn't vindictive, but he wasn't really doing much. He was like that withered fig tree. He was not producing anything of any great significance. But this was about to change. It happens when Francis is about 20. Francis is Francis, when he's about 20, gets himself involved in a war between Assisi and Perugia, and he gets captured and he's held prisoner for a year. And this is a minor skirmish. So what happens is that he then gets released, he goes back to Assisi, and he becomes very ill. He recovers, but when he recovers, he starts the beginnings of a change which Thomas of Solano, in his biography of Francis, comments on. Francis recovers, but he's also depressed. Francis is kind of floundering, and he's looking around. He looks at the world around him. He sees the physical world. He sees the beauty of the flowers and nature, and it doesn't really mean anything to him. And he's beginning to question what it means to, pardon me one moment, my cell phone. Francis is starting to question his world. He's starting to question materialism a little bit. But he's really just kind of floundering and trying to figure out what to do next. So what happens is, roughly about the time he's 22 or so, Francis decides he's going to become a knight. And he gets involved, or starts preparing to get involved, in a minor skirmish. And a couple of things happen here. He's about to get involved in a minor skirmish in Apulia, which was a fight between Frederick II, king, and papal forces. So again, the nobility and the church were often struggling with each other. And Francis decides he's going to fight for the papacy. What he was really interested in was trying to distinguish himself as a brave knight. This was the medieval period, after all. But a significant thing happens. And it also reveals that Francis was absolutely a medium. Francis is getting ready to get involved in this other war. And yet, he gets a communication. Thomas of Solano attributes it to Jesus. And the communication goes something like this. A voice asks him, Francis, who can do more for you, the servant or the Lord? And Francis says, the Lord. Then Francis thinks to ask, Lord, what do you want me to do? A little bit like Paul of Tarsus, when Paul encounters Jesus in Acts, Paul says, what do you want me to do? And the reply is, go back to the land of your birth, because I will fulfill your dream in a spiritual way. Thomas of Solano finds this moment significant because he says, in effect, that Francis traded his physical weapons, his fleshy weapons, if you will, for spiritual weapons. So Francis has no idea what's coming next, but he gets out of this war. He says, I'm not going to fight, and he leaves, and he goes back to Assisi. But things are starting to change. He's starting to change from within. He begins to spend more time in solitude. There's an incident, a story, for instance, that he was with a friend. They go to a cave, and Francis talks about hidden treasure in the cave, and he's really talking about God, because Francis was praying, and he goes into the cave and he would pray to God by himself. He would pray. So Francis was doing this more and more. But also, Francis decides to go to Rome with a friend. And while he's in Rome, he's is about to enter a church, but he sees a group of poor people outside the church who are begging for alms. And Francis decides to join them, which embarrasses his friend a lot. But Francis spends time, he eats with these group of poor people, he begs for alms along with them. He was trying to be more connected to them. And Thomas of Solano basically put it this way. He was saying that Francis was trying to connect more to the poor. It wasn't that one moment. Okay, possible technical problems, but I'm going to keep going. So Francis starts to try and connect more with the poor. It's not that he was ashamed of his wealth, but rather he was having more empathy. He was beginning to connect to what Spiritists are very familiar with, that all people are our brothers and sisters, regardless of who they are. And so Francis was trying to work through one of his mountains, which was to be distant between himself and, say, poor people, because he, after all, came from a background of privilege. So Francis is trying to kind of go through that barrier. But also, what Francis does, and this is significant, is that he begins to care for lepers. Francis was repulsed by lepers. There is a moment that is described in his biography in which Francis is riding his horse and he comes across a leper. And Francis is like, oh God, do I really have to do this? Because Francis couldn't even stand the smell of lepers. But Francis knows what God wants him to do. So Francis gets off his horse. He gives money to this leper, which the leper was asking for. But then Francis goes one step further. What he does is that he one moment. What Francis does is that he, besides giving money to this leper, he kisses the hand of this leper. So again, Francis is confronting his own inner mountains, if you will, by reaching out to someone that he would have been afraid to go near not too long before. And this begins to free Francis. So then what Francis does is that he has a significant moment. The next thing that happens to him is that Francis does work for his father. And he goes to a nearby town close to Assisi to sell cloth for his father. So he rides on his horse and he sells the cloth. And then what happens is that Francis sells the cloth, gets the money, but he also sells his horse. Horses were valuable back then. So Francis now has to walk back to Assisi. Why did he do this? Well, it so happens that as he was walking back to Assisi, he passes by an abandoned church, San Damiano. And Francis goes into this abandoned church and decides to pray. So Francis, while he's praying, receives another message. And the message is basically that Francis receives a message from Jesus saying that As you can see, my house is in ruins. I need you to rebuild it. So is okay. Francis uh, is a little confused at this point about what to do. But what he does is that he decides he's being told to rebuild this church. So he starts to rebuild this church, only there's a little problem. The problem is basically this: he's using his father's money to rebuild the church. Therefore, what's happening is that Francis is going to get himself into some trouble with his father. His father eventually finds out that Francis is using his money to rebuild this church, which in his father's mind is a waste and kind of a crazy idea. And Francis knows that his father's looking for him. So while Francis is working on the church, Francis decides he better hide from his father for a while. So he goes inside a pit, or and he stays there for almost a month. And while he's in this pit, Francis then has a lot of time to think. And he prays and he prays and he prays. And he thinks about what he's going to do next. You can imagine how uncomfortable this was. It's described that he rarely came out of this pit. Food would be lowered into him. Even if for bodily functions, if you will, Francis would not necessarily, would maybe come out a little bit from the pit, but not too often. So Francis was giving himself extra time. He was hoping that his father would become less angry with some time and distance. But also Francis, one can imagine, was starting to figure out, where am I going to go next with my life? What am I doing? How can I be of service to God? What path am I really on? Well, Francis realizes he needs to confront his father. So what he does is that he gets out of the pit and he goes into Assisi. Now, he's really dirty. He looks pretty disheveled. And people think that he is crazy. And people are gossiping in Assisi. So then what happens is that Francis is uh, finally confronts his father. His father beats him, locks him up in chains. If you locked somebody up in chains, if a parent locked a child up in chains today, they would go to jail. But this was the Middle Ages. Francis's father leaves town again, leaving his son in chains. Francis's mother feels sorry for him and she frees him. Francis goes back to San Damiano to continue rebuilding the church. When his father, Pietro de Benedoni, comes back, he is upset. At that point, what happens is that his father takes Francis and wants to drag him to the church to have the church punish him in some way. But this becomes complicated because Francis is there before the Bishop of Assisi, and Francis is going through a conversion. And the bishop notices that Francis is going through a conversion. So the bishop is not necessarily thinking that the thing to do is to punish Francis the way his father wants. Then comes a very famous moment, one that maybe you've heard of. Francis decides in this open square in front of everybody, including the bishop, Francis takes off his clothes and he then hands his clothes over to his father. Francis has decided that he is going to essentially relinquish everything that connects him to his father. In a way, what was happening here is that Francis was now really ready to emulate Christ, and that would mean embracing his spiritual family over his biological one. And you can imagine how painful that was for his parents. In the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, I had images of this before. There's a scene in that movie where Francis, after he's become a friar, goes back into his home and he sees his parents. And while there, he can see how sad they are, but he doesn't connect with them again. He just notices them from a distance and then he leaves. Francis realizes that he can't go back to his life that he had with his family. He now has a spiritual family instead. So he embraces radical poverty. And what he does, and it's described this way in the book Love Exists Among Us by Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro. He's pointing out that Francis's followers, what Francis inspired in people was that he wanted to emphasize that in choosing poverty, he wasn't saying wealth is bad. He was showing that wealth should be shared, but he was also trying to connect through love, and that that's what was more important to him. People thought Francis was nuts, but at the same time, people were observing Francis and they saw how happy he was. In spite of everything that he was going through, he seemed genuinely happy, and that began to catch on. He attracted some followers, and they finished building San Damiano. And in finishing San Damiano, this, by the way, would become a future home for Clare of Assisi, who was another very prominent Christian. I won't get into that now, but so there was a purpose in rebuilding this church. But the question still remains, what was the purpose of that message that Francis received through the cross or crucifix of Jesus in the abandoned San Damiano? As you can see, my house is broken. I need you to repair it, in effect. So Francis starts to think, what does it mean to repair the broken house? Well, Francis soon begins to find the order of the Friars Minor. And what happens is that Francis is he goes to a feast in St. Matthias. This is about the year 1208, by the way. And Francis hears a sermon there about what Jesus says as advice to his apostles. This is from Matthew chapter 10, verses 9 through 16. Jesus advises his apostles when it's time for them to go out and preach, as it were. They should not bring any gold, silver, copper in their belts. Don't carry anything of value. And not even a staff, nothing. Abject poverty. And when you go to a village, look for anybody there who is worthy and see if you can stay with that person until you leave. And then Jesus goes on to advise that if anyone will not receive you and does not accept you, shake the dust from your feet as you leave that town. In other words, don't try to convince people to follow the teachings of Jesus if they really don't want to listen. Then Jesus says something interesting to his apostles about how they should approach going out and preaching. He says, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. In other words, Jesus was saying, be kind, be gentle, but don't be naive. And the gospel, according to Spiritism, chapter 19, Faith Moves Mountains, picks up on this. It talks about the way in which it is important to be able to be practical. In other words, if you carry much in terms of money and things like that, you're putting yourself at risk. And Francis did get beaten up, by the way, early on in his efforts to carry out the teachings of Jesus. So Francis finds the Order of the Brothers Minor. And then by 1209 or so, they decide that they need to go to Rome to visit the Pope, if they can, to see if they can get the Pope Innocent III to bless their efforts. There are some practical reasons for this. Francis and his followers, there were about 12 of them, were trying to start a new movement in a way by emulating the teachings of Jesus. There was a strong risk that they could be labeled as heretics. So as a result of that, what happened is that Francis wanted to make sure they got the blessing of the Pope. So they go and they see Pope Innocent III. And at first, the Pope is a little reluctant about this. In the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, which is about the life of Francis, the way they showed this scene is that Francis and his fellow brothers, go into this elaborate, ornate church, and there's all this clergy around who are the upper echelons of the church, and they all look like kings and princesses and so forth. And they're all staring at Francis with some suspicion and so forth. And then what happens is that Francis and his followers eventually are able to get a meeting with the Pope. And the Pope, historically speaking, this is what happened. The Pope took a while to be convinced, but he finally realized that Francis was genuine. And eventually, by 1210, Pope Innocent III blesses the Order of the Friars Minor. So, in the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, the depiction of it is that the Pope talks about how Francis, in many ways, understands or understood Jesus better than most people do, and that the institution of the church had taken over, become too powerful almost for its own good. But that's how it was. And the Pope in the movie, this is not historically accurate, by the way, but in the movie, Francis, or the Pope, I mean, Pope Innocent III gets down on his knees and kisses Francis' feet as a sign of humility and reverence and for what Francis is doing. Again, Francis was not interested in tearing down the church at all. So when he got the message at San Damiano before, through the crucifix of Jesus, the message was, as you can see, my house is broken. So Francis eventually was led to understand that he had to emulate Jesus as best he could and carry out the works of Jesus by example. Again, another idea of what it means to go and preach. And by leading through his own example, people would begin to understand that, yes, indeed, Francis really understood what it meant to what Christianity really means in practice. I'm going to conclude, but I'll mention a couple of other things. The Gospel according to Spiritism talks about this theme of teaching through example. The more we show through example, not lecture, not tell people you should follow God, but just live by example, the more that's liable to touch the hearts of others. And that's really what it's all about. We don't have to go out and convince anybody through words. We need to do it through actions. And the more we do that, the more we develop an unshakable faith and hope, and people will begin to see that. Not that we're trying to do that. First and foremost, we just need to be the best that we can be as individuals. Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro, in the book Love Exists Among Us, emphasizes that Francis was the gap, the bridge between heaven and earth, and that divine thought sort of flowed through him or materialized through him. It could be understood through him. And that anyone who had an affinity with what Francis represented could also connect to this same divine force. Francis put it this way himself in a letter. There aren't too many letters from Francis that survive, but there's one that was to his entire order. And he says, only through the Spirit can we connect with God. The Spirit is the one who makes the Word of God come alive. In other words, the Spirit is key. And that idea gets touched upon in question 11 of the Spirit's book, which says that humans will see and understand God when their minds are no longer obscured by matter, and when they have come closer by striving for perfection. In other words, the more we tap into this force that I mentioned before, the more we can begin to connect, and the more it begins to open things up for us. Francis certainly understood this. And what Francis was able to do was, in this way, the real way you comprehend God is by doing your best to emulate good works through faith and so forth. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted here. Peter, thank you so much for your presentation. Uh, to me, particularly, it was very special because I'm a great admirer of Francis of Assisi, and I try every now and then to, to review everything that he has done, all the commitments, and up to now, I imagine that for the average of us, it's so hard to follow in his footsteps as well. It's definitely a very special spirit that we know that has been helping and assisting us in our spiritual journey as well. And so we are very, very happy for your presentation, for everything that we learned today. And actually, you brought some new things I didn't know about this biographer, and it was really important for us to hear all of that. So. If you feel like it, we would love if you could do our final prayer before we end our presentation today.
Certainly, I'd be happy to. Dear God, dear Jesus, we are thankful for all the ways in which you are in our lives. We thank you for your guidance and your support. We ask that your light be able to work its way through us and through all those we come into contact with. May all of us have light on the inside so that we can spread light on the outside. Please bless the time that we are in by inspiring us to use our creativity, our faith, and our strength to guide ourselves through this period that we are in. Please bless all those who are struggling. May they be surrounded with peace, love, comfort, assistance, compassion. Please bless all of our brothers and sisters everywhere. Amen.
So thank you everyone that has followed us yet again this Saturday, and go and preach.